Welcome back to MVM. Today we are going to be taking a look at a game called OROS from Brant Binkerhoff, the designer, illustrator, and just about everything, and his company Ash Games. This game is doing a lot of different things that you probably haven't seen before, and we're going to do our best to try to, I don't know if we can put this into any bucket.
Yeah, you really can't. I'm going to try. Well, at least I'm going to call it a puzzle game.
It's
a
definitely
competitive puzzle game. But that doesn't do justice to exactly what's happening here. So in order for us to help you understand the game, we just want to kind of talk about the layout of the game and what you're seeing in front of you. This is a board that is a game already in progress. You'll see a lot of different tiles out here in what is effectively the water. The goal of the game is to kind of make these little islands, and we're doing that by shifting tiles around constantly. You're going to be shifting these tiles and causing them to collide with other tiles, and you're going to be erupting volcanoes and causing them to create new land masses. All of that's happening in service of our goal as demigods to place out these little sacred sites across the board.
Yeah, the sacred sites is where you're going to get most of your knowledge, and knowledge is victory points in this game. The only other thing you're going to see out here, like Ryan referenced, all these different land masses from islands all the way up to mountains. And the mountains are what you're going to need to create to build those sacred sites. And then you've got different levels of volcanoes. The volcanoes are another thing that are going to erupt to create even more land. So while this isn't a traditional tile placement game, it's kind of a tile replacement game, because through colliding and volcanoes and all sorts of other things, you're going to be changing and interchanging these tiles out onto the board, all in the goal of trying to build those sacred sites.
Yeah, it's kind of like one of those numbers games you might see where you're combining different numbers to create other tiles. If you put two ones together and they collide, it makes a 2. If you put a 3 and a 1 together, it makes a 4. Eventually, if you can collide two 4s, you'll make a mountain. That sounds a lot easier than it is, because while you're trying to create mountains near your followers on the board so that you could just hop over there and you can make your sacred sites, other players are doing the same thing. So what you have is a board that is constantly shifting and changing with every player's turn. These tiles are going to be moving. Not only that, they can loop around, they can follow these arrows that you see here. So when it gets back around to you, you've got an almost completely different board state, and you can try to predict what other players are going to do, but it's very difficult to do that.
Yeah, and the way that you're going to want to do that is through your own player board. Each demigod is going to have a player board, and this is where you're going to be taking all of your actions and also evolving what you can do, because you might have a very different player board than the player next to you by the end of the game, and it's going to give you levels of powers so that you can maybe erupt more volcanoes, shift more tiles, move your followers further, all sorts of things. We'll get into all those actions in a second. But the cool thing about the player board is you're going to have the action selection at the bottom, and then all of those actions above it are going to have varying powers that you can level up with wisdom, which is another resource, if you will, that you're going to collect throughout the game.
Yeah, and that action selection mechanic that powers this game is very unique here. You're looking at a certain number of actions, and you have your followers covering them. Any action that's covered is unavailable to you. You can only take the actions that are face up. If those actions don't work for you, well, you should have planned better, basically, because this game is all about planning ahead. Because as you move these followers to take actions, you're uncovering the action that they were on, and you're going to get to take 3 of these actions a turn. So you're not only having to worry about what do I want to do this turn, you're also worrying about what actions do I want to leave for myself in the next turn, because it becomes very important which follower you use, because it's kind of a twofer there. You're taking an action and freeing up an action.
No, absolutely. And the interesting thing is, this is a game where you might unlock extra followers, which sounds great, but it's just going to clog your actions a little bit more. So the game does give you the opportunity to put those followers out onto the main board, because you're going to have to move them around in order to build those sacred sites. Also, there's a place on your player board that you can send them to study. Whenever you pull these guys back, they're going to bring back wisdom that you can use to upgrade these powers. So why don't we talk about the actions as much as we can. We're not going to go through all of them in great detail, but you absolutely have to get at least some understanding how your actions are going to manipulate the main board.
Yeah, the goal, basically, like I said earlier, of any one of these actions is to get your follower to a mountain and then build a sacred site on that mountain. But the way that you're going to get there can be very different, because like David said, you can upgrade your player board. So one of the most basic actions you have is simply to move your follower around the board. You can move and you can climb up these different sacred sites. And you can move to adjacent tiles, eventually gaining the power to even cross water and things like that. You think that's probably, you'd think, the primary way to move your guy around the board. But when you can't move your guy around the board, maybe you just move the board.
Yeah, you can move the board. One of the first actions you can take is to shift tiles. And when you shift tiles, there's also an action to move tiles, and they're quite different. When you're shifting, you're taking an entire column or row, if you will, and shifting all those tiles a set number of spaces. Now, at the beginning, at level 1, you can only move those one space, but as you use wisdom to level up that power, you can move them multiple spaces. And in fact, high enough, you can move mountains, because you can't move mountains at the beginning of the game. So once mountains are created, it sort of starts to clog up the board, so you can't really move it. It's almost like a Rubik's Cube that is broken.
Yeah, that's a good way to explain it. But again, you might rely on a power that has the ability to move mountains, to move those mountains. Or you might just rely on somebody else to try to move things.
Right.
Because when somebody is trying to build a sacred site, each player can build a sacred site on every mountain. So if you see another player trying to position themselves to build a mountain, to create a mountain, you might want to be right next to them. Because once they create their sacred site, on your turn, you can do the same thing.
Yeah, the interesting thing about sacred sites, you're only ever going to be able to build one of your sacred sites on a location. And they stack one over the other. You're going to start with a monolith, then a shrine will go on top of that, and then the temple goes on the very top. One of the other actions you can take is to move tiles. So this is different than shifting. When you move tiles, at the beginning of the game, you can move a set of 3 that are orthogonally adjacent to each other in a straight line. And when you move them, this is when they can collide with other land. For instance, if I were to move 3 tiles into these other tiles, some of them will just move over, others will collide with the other tiles to make those bigger tiles like Ryan was mentioning.
Yeah, and this can also create volcanoes, because you can only ever have a level 4 tile. Anything that would be in excess of 4 kind of erupts out of the ground and creates a volcano up to a level 4 volcano. So you can have a lot of these volcanoes, as you see, spread out on the board, because another action is to make them erupt. And this is how you create new land masses. This ensures that you never have a completely empty board, and also, again, clogs up the board, making it harder to do some things. But you need these land masses, you need these volcanoes to erupt so that you can slam them together and eventually create those mountains.
And this is another one of those powers you can upgrade, because at the beginning you can only erupt one volcano. Alternatively, you could place another volcano out there with that action. But later you can erupt multiple volcanoes. And I will touch on this very briefly, but you're going to be able to move land into the space where it's erupting from. For instance, this has a 2 volcano. If I erupt it, it has to fill that tile first. Once that tile is a 4 land mass, then you can decide which direction you want that lava to flow, creating more and more land. Late in the game, you might be able to erupt a few volcanoes and really create a massive amount of land on the board.
Yeah, so if you haven't gathered it from now, this is a very thinky game.
Yes.
Because you'll have a lot of ways to solve this puzzle. Like David said, with the upgradable player board, if you want to move land, if you want to shift land, if you want to build and erupt volcanoes, these are all ways that you can manipulate the board to get those mountains next to you. In fact, you don't have to move your follower at all. If you can bring the mountain to you, your follower can stay where they are.
Yeah, and that's one of the beauties about how you use your wisdom to upgrade your powers. Because in some of the games we've played, I upgraded my journey followers action that allowed me to move my followers around the board great distances, crossing water, not water spaces, but water edges on some of the tiles, which you can't typically do. So Ryan would watch me do that, kind of maybe get a little jealous that I was moving around.
I moved one space is what I had.
All the while, he had upgraded his shift tiles so that he could shift mountains, which is also something that made me tremendously jealous, because if you can't shift mountains, you really can't, late in the game, move many tiles around the board. So you have to rely on the fact that you're moving your follower around.
Yeah, and after you've made the mountain by whatever means you've made it, and after you've gotten your follower there by whatever means you've gotten them there, then you can actually build a sacred site, which is one of the abilities. If you're the first player there, you're going to lay down your base, which is worth the fewest amount of points. But then another player can come in there and they can build their second level, which is worth more points, and then eventually someone can build that temple, like David said. Now, you have a decision to make. Every time you build a sacred site, you're going to place your follower on that site, and they can stay there for the rest of the game. If they end the game there, you're going to get some extra points. And anytime someone comes and builds where you are, you're going to get some extra wisdom as well. So it's kind of a good idea to keep your follower there. But if you move them, they could be building more sacred sites in other places.
Yeah, there's an interesting balance that takes place with your followers, because mid-game and a little after that, you're going to have at least a follower or more out on the board. You're going to have some followers here. You might have some followers sent to study up on the top of your board. You're trying to balance not having this really clogged up, but also having enough followers to move around and do what you want to do. But having followers out here is really great, because one of the actions is bringing those followers back, and that's when you gain wisdom.
Yeah.
So you're going to want to send your followers out, send them up to study, bring them back, get that wisdom, spend it to upgrade your powers, doing all of this while doing all of the other things that we've already described.
And you're doing all of this in service of your demigod, like we talked about at the very beginning. This ziggurat here is kind of your scoreboard almost. Everything you do as far as building the sacred temples and upgrading some of your actions is going to allow you to ascend on this ziggurat. When somebody gets to the top of the ziggurat, then it's the end of the game. It triggers the end of the game, and the top player will get 15 points, that's no small amount of points in this game.
Yeah, you're definitely going to want to climb up this,
Yeah.
and typically by the end of the game, everyone is going to be up towards the top. Another interesting thing about this is there's a couple places marked here that adds more volcanoes, so it keeps the land a little fresh out there. And these also serve as sort of like milestones for the game. Once you get to this spot here, you know that game is about to end. So if you've ever spent a game figuring out when you need to pivot, when you get up to certain points in this ziggurat will tell you need to stop laying groundwork and start scoring points.
Start scoring points for sure, because that will trigger the end of the game. And there's a lot of ways you're going to score points. You're going to score from each of the 3 different types of sacred sites that you placed out there. You can level up your player board to actually make them worth more points. Yeah. And each one of the actions that you can upgrade can potentially earn you points. Plus, you're going to get points for all of your followers that are out on sacred sites. Again, upgradable. You could upgrade that to score more points. So I don't want to call it necessarily point salad, but there are a lot of different points coming in for your final
sure.
score.
There's a ton of different ways to score points, and by the end of the game, not only is your player board going to be likely quite different than the other players at the table, but the way you've scored your points is as well. One thing that we want to mention before we wrap up is the fact that there's a great automa in this game as well. When you play this with 2 players or fewer, you need to have some automa involved. And Ryan has the automa board over here.
I do, and what's really cool is the other side of every one of these player boards is an automa board, and each one of these colors represents kind of a different demigod.
Yeah.
And their AI works differently. Some of them are more aggressive, some of them are friendlier. But the AI is going to have a deck of cards that instructs you as to what they do on their turn, which is even more chaotic than trying to predict what another player is going to do. Because if you're playing with a solo game or a small player count, this can really throw a wrench into the gearworks, because they're just moving tiles and placing mountains all over the place.
Yeah, but like Ryan said earlier, that can also sometimes help you.
It can.
Like you might be planning something on your turn, and that automa, or even another player, might shift things, and you're like, oh, well, thank you very much, because now I can get right to that location. So there is a lot to think about in this game, and like we said, we haven't even been able to do this justice. You really need to play this to experience it.
Right.
You're going to want to check out all the details on the campaign, but if you have any questions at all, please feel free to make them in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer as many as we possibly can.
We should be able to.
Yeah.
And yeah, we were talking right before we sat down, just about how difficult it is to explain exactly how hard it is to think about the puzzle here, which is really cool. If you like those thinky puzzle games, this is going to be right up your alley. I mean, you're going to love this game, I think.
Absolutely. And until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then. Congratulations, you got to the end of one of our videos. Now, if you want more practice, just click on the video over here. It's another video. You might not have seen it yet, so click on it. If you don't want to do that, at least click on the subscription button below. That always helps us. And if you want notifications, please ring that bell.